Does the gentleman from Mississippi seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol, I call up House Report 117-284.
The clerk will report the title.
Resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find Peter K. Navarro and Daniel Scavino, Jr. in contempt of Congress for refusal to comply with subpoenas duly issued by the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol.
Pursuant to House Resolution 1023, the report is considered as read. For what purpose does the gentleman from Mississippi seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol, I call up House Resolution 1037 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 1037, resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find Peter K. Navarro and Daniel Scavino, Jr. in contempt of Congress for refusal to comply with subpoenas duly issued by the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol.
Pursuant to House Resolution 1023, the resolution is considered as read and shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided among and controlled by the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, and an opponent of their respective designees. The gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, the gentleman from Wyoming, the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, and the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on this measure.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's time is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to start our debate by talking a little bit about what the American people ought to expect of their leaders, of those who hold positions of public trust, the responsibilities that come with it. I've been thinking about these responsibilities for more than 50 years, and all the time I've been fortunate enough to hold a position of public trust. It doesn't matter if you're an alderman, a mayor, a member of Congress, President of the United States, or a staff member working as a civil servant or a political appointee. When you work for the public, when the people taxes pay your salary, these jobs come with serious rules and serious obligations. Dan Scavino and Peter Navarro both held positions of public trust. Mr. Scavino was a top communications official in the Trump White House. Mr. Navarro was a trade advisor. They each drew salaries paid by the American people to the tune of over $180,000 per year. They both were to abide by certain rules and obligations. They both swore oaths of allegiance to the Constitution. The Select Committee wants to talk to them, but about a lot more than their White House jobs. We want to talk to them about their roles in trying to overturn the 2020 election. We subpoenaed them for their records and testimony. They told us to buzz off. Not a single record, no shows for their deposition. Their excuse was, as former White House employees, the information we wanted, again, information about overturning an election, was shielded by executive privilege, a protection for the president to make sure sensitive official conversations stay private. In other words, they're arguing that their roles in trying to overturn an election had to stay secret because they had official roles as advisors to ex-president. If they want to make those claims, ridiculous as they sound, here's what the law requires. They need to show up and make those claims on the record under oath. They refuse to do that. That alone means they are in contempt of Congress. But I want to dig a little deeper into the argument these men are making. As I mentioned before, these are rules and obligations that bind public servants. One of the most important rules is that you can't do campaign work on government time or using taxpayers' money. Pretty straightforward. Plenty you can do on your own time, but not when you're on the clock. That's the law. If you've heard of the Hatch Act, it's probably been when a cabinet secretary or White House official had crossed the line from their official duties into political matters. In fact, in 2020, Mr. Navarro was dinged by a government watchdog for violating the Hatch Act by using official role to attack President Joe Biden. That law prohibits, among other things, someone from using, and I'm quoting, official authority or influence for the purpose of interfering with or affecting the results of an election. Sounds familiar? And in the case of Mr. Navarro and Mr. Scavino, trying to affect the results of an election wasn't knocking on doors or putting signs in people's front yard. They were trying to help a defeated president stay in power. It's not conceivable that their involvement in that effort could have legally overlapped with their official duties. But beyond that, it was a betrayal of the oath these men took. It was a betrayal of the public trust. Even if you do it on your own time, trying to overturn an election is still trying to overturn an election. And when we know that people who stormed this building on January 6th had the same goal, trying to overturn an election, that's what the Select Committee is investigating. That's why we need to hear from Mr. Scavino and Mr. Navarro. But as the Select Committee works to provide answers to American people, these two are saying, I worked at the White House when all this took place. Even if I was plotting to overturn the government, I was collecting a government salary at the time, so I don't have time to talk about it. Can you imagine? I've served my community and my country most of my life. Like my colleagues in this body, I've labored to uphold my oath and do right by the people I serve. I know my constituents expect that of me. To run into this kind of obstruction, this kind of cynical behavior as we investigate a violent insurrection is just despicable. It can't stand. Dan Scavino and Peter Navarro must be held accountable for their abuses of the public trust. They must be held accountable for their defiance of the law. They are in contempt of Congress, which is a crime. And I call on my colleagues to do their duty, to defend this institution and the rule of law, and to vote yes on this resolution. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, the Select Committee has now conducted over 800 interviews and depositions of witnesses who have knowledge of the events of January 6th. This includes more than a dozen former Trump White House staff members. So, Mr. Speaker, when you hear my colleagues make political, partisan attacks on the Select Committee, I hope that all of us can remember some basic facts. Through these interviews, we have learned that President Trump and his team were warned in advance and repeatedly that the efforts they undertook to overturn the 2020 election would violate the law and our Constitution. They were warned that January 6th could and likely would turn violent. And they were told repeatedly by our state and federal courts, by our Justice Department, and by agencies of our intelligence community that the allegations of widespread fraud sufficient to overturn an election were false and were unsupported by the evidence. And yet, despite all of these specific warnings, President Trump and his team moved willfully through multiple means to attempt to halt the peaceful transfer of power, to halt the constitutional process for counting votes, and to shatter the constitutional bedrock of our great nation. as a federal judge has recently concluded the illegality of President Trump's plan for January 6th was, quote, obvious. We're here today to address two specific witnesses who have refused to appear for testimony before the committee. The committee has many questions for Mr. Scavino about his political social media work for President Trump, including his interactions with an online forum called the Donald.win and with QAnon, a bizarre and dangerous cult. Mr. Scavino worked directly with President Trump to spread President Trump's false message that the election was stolen and to recruit Americans to come to Washington on January 6th to, quote, take back their country. This effort to deceive was widely effective and widely destructive, and Donald Trump's stolen election campaign succeeded in provoking the violence on January 6th. On this point, there is no doubt. The committee has videos, interviews, and sworn statements from violent rioters demonstrating these facts. Mr. Navarro will also be a key witness. He has written a book boasting about his role in planning and coordinating the activity of January 6th. We have many questions for Mr. Navarro, including about his communications with Roger Stone and Steve Bannon regarding the planning for January 6th. And as Judge Carter recently concluded, quote, based on the evidence, the court finds it more likely than not that President Trump corruptly attempted to obstruct the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021. In the case of both of these witnesses, Mr. Speaker, the committee would rather have their testimony than have to move this contempt citation. When you hear my colleagues attack the Select Committee, remember, Mr. Scavino and Mr. Navarro have chosen not to appear. They did not have to make this choice, but they did. In America, no one is above the law. Neither Mr. Trump, nor Mr. Scavino, nor Mr. Navarro is some form of royalty. There is no such thing in America as the privileges of the crown. Every citizen has a duty to comply with a subpoena. And Mr. Speaker, when you hear my colleagues challenge the committee's legislative purpose, remember, the D.C. Circuit and the Supreme Court of the United States have affirmed our legislative purpose. Too many Republicans are once again ignoring the rulings of the courts, as many of them did in the run-up to January 6th. Mr. Speaker, the tale of what happened following the 2020 election, resulting in the violence of January 6th, is a tale of stunning deceit. It is a tale of lies about our election and contempt for the rulings of our courts. The election claims made by Donald Trump were so frivolous and so unfounded that the president's lead lawyer did not just lose these cases, he lost his license to practice law. The New York Supreme Court found, quote, there is uncontroverted evidence that Mr. Giuliani communicated demonstrably false and misleading statements to courts, lawmakers, and the public at large in his capacity as lawyer for former President Donald J. Trump and the Trump campaign in connection with Trump's failed effort at re-election in 2020. Mr. Speaker, those in this chamber who continue to embrace the former president and his dangerous and destructive lies ought to take a good, hard look at themselves. At a moment of real danger to our republic, when the need for fidelity to our Constitution is paramount, they have abandoned their oaths in order to perform for Donald Trump. That will be their legacy. Madam Chair, this is not a close call. Mr. Navarro and Mr. Scavino have chosen not to comply with a congressional subpoena. They are in contempt. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I hope this is the last time that we do this. Just last week, we watched members of the January 6th committee criticize the DOJ for not jailing their political opponents fast enough. Now the committee is trying to refer 2 more of President Trump's advisors to the DOJ for criminal prosecution. The same DOJ, by the way, has slandered concerned parents as domestic terrorists. A DOJ overseen by a president who said President Trump should be prosecuted. So let's be clear, we aren't voting today to rename a post office. So please, let's be honest with ourselves. A vote to hold Dan Scavino and Peter Navarro in contempt of Congress is a vote to put them in jail for a year. Neither of these men deserve this. The party line isn't a good enough excuse today. Disliking their politics isn't an excuse. You know, Mr. Scavino has 2 boys. He's a good dad. He doesn't deserve this. His boys definitely don't deserve this. So before we vote today, I've got to ask, could anyone here explain to those boys why their dad deserves to be behind bars for a year? Mr. Scavino grew up in a working-class family in New York City. He's a former caddy who worked his way up to the White House through hard work and determination. Mr. Scavino lived the American dream. Now, thanks to the Select Committee, he's living an authoritarian nightmare. The Select Committee will say that it's Mr. Scavino's fault for refusing to cooperate, they say. That is simply not true. Mr. Scavino asked time and again for the committee to follow the rule of law and provide him with a narrow and specific legislative purpose for the information that they were seeking. He asked, "How is what you want from me pertinent to your investigation?" And they refused to explain. But remember what they said last week. The January 6th committee must enforce its subpoenas. But contempt is not enforcement, it is punishment. Contempt won't get the committee any information. Only the court can do that. But they don't want to go to the judiciary. They don't want neutral arbitration. They want political punishment. The Select Committee has never been interested in fact-finding. In fact, Jim Jordan and I were both blocked from sitting on the committee because we promised to fully investigate the security failure at the Capitol. The Democrat leaders don't want that. They claim they blocked us for being too partisan. Meanwhile, the committee's lead staffer signed his name to a false letter calling the Hunter Biden laptop Russian disinformation. Apparently, lying to undermine democracy is a key qualification for employment of this committee. If the January 6th committee gets its way, Congress will have referred 4 former Trump officials for prosecution in under 6 months. Another record for the 117th Congress. The Select Committee aims to do 2 things: silence legitimate questions about the breakdown of security at the Capitol and punish their political opponents. It's that simple. Dan Scavino is accused of listening to his boss, the former commander-in-chief, who told him to, quote, invoke all applicable privileges and immunities. Today's vote is not about wrongdoing, and it isn't about anybody's character, no matter what they say. Today's vote is about the character of this House. It's about abusing the seat of our democracy to attack American democracy. The question is, do we live in a country where you can go to jail for working for the wrong politician? Would you want to live in that country? The question is, will you help create that country? Because I think we've had a pretty good thing going for the last 240 years. And that's exactly why I urge all of my colleagues to vote no on this resolution today. Thank you. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much. Just for the record, Madam Speaker, let me say that we are here for this contempt process today, but the President's own daughter complied with the wishes of the committee. And I would think that if his daughter complied with the wishes of the committee, everyone else should. even the people who work for him. Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Maryland, the distinguished majority leader of the House, Mr. Hoyer.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman from Mississippi for yielding. I thank the gentlelady from Wyoming for her courage in standing for the truth. I disagree with many things that the previous speaker said. I disagree with his premises and with his conclusion in many respects. But I do agree with him on one thing. This vote is about the character of the House. I agree with him on that, which is why 435 of us ought to vote for this resolution, so that the House can do its duty. Mr. Speaker, once again, we are forced to take this step, asking the Justice Department to charge individuals with criminal contempt for refusing to answer subpoenas as issued by the committee investigating the attack on our Capitol and our democracy on January 6, 2021. The two gentlemen of which the previous speaker spoke, I don't know. I have no quarrel with them individually. But we are a nation of laws, not of men. And if we are to be a nation of laws, then we need to respond to legal process. And if we think the assertions are wrong, we need to make our case. On the merits of this resolution, there should be no doubt, and it is about the character of this House. The courage of this House to seek honesty, to seek truth. The individuals in question had intimate knowledge of the former president's actions and decisions on that day. No matter who their children are, no matter what their life has been, they have knowledge that it is important for the American people to have through their representatives in Congress. Americans must have a full accounting of what transpired on January 6th and in the weeks leading up to it and perhaps subsequent. That is what the Bipartisan Select Committee has been tasked with undertaking by a vote of this House. Sadly, I expect maybe most of my colleagues across the aisle will vote against this resolution. It is about the character of this House. Perhaps they agree with the Republican National Committee, which has said that the violent, Trump-led insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, the deaths and injury of U.S. Capitol police officers, and an effort to prevent the certification of an election was, and I quote the Republican National Committee, legitimate political discourse. How can anybody make that assertion? How can anybody in the Republican National Committee vote for it? Why doesn't everybody on the Republican Party side of the aisle say that is not what we believe? Silence prevails. There is no doubt that the insurrection on January 6th itself was a danger to our democracy. But I agree with the Washington Post columnist and former White House speechwriter for Republican President George W. Bush, Michael Gerson, who wrote on December 16th, and I quote, "It is Republican tolerance for the intolerable that threatens American democracy." Very frankly, my friends on the other side of the aisle ought to be celebrating those in their ranks who have the courage to stand up for the truth. I've told Liz Cheney if John Kennedy were writing his book in Profiles in Courage today, I would urge him to include her and Adam Kinzinger in that book. January 6th was a peril, a day of peril for America. But the greater crisis is when one of our two main political parties has become so hijacked by extremism and so enthralled to a dangerous demagogue that it condones, even celebrates, insurrection and violence. Mr. Speaker, how can the same party that claims it honors law enforcement simultaneously declare that violent attacks against police officers are legitimate? How can one of our two political parties be so craven for short-term partisan gain that it is willing to encourage and condone insurrection? How can its members use their sacred votes in the House, the people's House, in an effort to impede the investigation of this dark and dangerous day in the history of our democracy? Because that's what this vote is about. Not only the character of this House, but the character of this country, the character of the people who demand, hopefully, truth. Because that is what will set us all free. Because that's what this vote is about. Whether you believe that the violent attack on January 6th, one in which a mob threatened the life of the Republican vice president, legitimate political discourse, and threatened the life of the Speaker of this House, the Speaker of all the House, an attempt to overthrow our democracy, does that constitute legitimate political discourse? Mr. Speaker, I can't believe Americans believe that. And we must reject that theory that the violence that we saw on January 6th, the hate that we saw on January 6th, is somehow legitimate political discourse. Because if people believe that, then our democracy is in grave danger. This vote is about whether you believe a certain individual can be held above the law in our country. It's about whether you believe the American people deserve to know all the facts about January 6th and whether those responsible for the attack ought to be held responsible. And most fundamentally, Mr. Speaker, it is about whether the Congress can fulfill its constitutional responsibility and ability to determine the truth. Madam Speaker, Mr. Speaker, this vote will reveal to us who is willing to show tolerance for the intolerable. It will reveal to us who is willing to stand up and defend our democracy and the rule of law, irrespective of party, irrespective of personality. That is a call to patriotism, to love of country, and to love of Constitution. My fellow colleagues, let us do our duty to the Constitution, to the Declaration, to our democracy, and to the people we represent. Vote yes.
The gentleman from Mississippi reserves the balance of his time. The gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I think it's very important as our colleagues consider their vote on this resolution to keep in mind the facts. Number one, neither Mr. Scavino nor Mr. Navarro has appeared in front of this committee. As I mentioned earlier, we have interviewed over 800 witnesses. The vast majority of them have cooperated fully and answered our questions. Some of the witnesses have taken the fifth. Some of the witnesses have answered some questions and asserted a privilege on other questions. But the notion that somehow the former president can instruct someone not to appear, that is not sustainable. That is not found anywhere in the law. And so if Mr. Scavino or Mr. Navarro wants to assert some kind of a privilege, and again, our questions for them have to do with their activities that are political activities that are not covered by executive privilege. But if they wish to assert that privilege, they can appear and do so. I would also just note, Madam Speaker, that in Trump v. Thompson, the D.C. Circuit held, and then we were upheld in the Supreme Court, held that the committee's need for this information outweighs the former president's right to any kind of confidentiality. And I think it's important for those facts to be clear and to be on the record. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves the balance for time. The gentleman from Indiana is now recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Gas prices are rising. The border has become a turnstile. Inflation is crushing our fellow Americans. And here we are, back on the floor of the House, reliving January 6th. Some of the members of the January 6th committee come from the swamps of Washington, D.C. I come from the swamps of Florida, and I know alligator tears when I see them. And yet we are lectured about performing for the former president. The reason Scavino and Navarro shouldn't be held in contempt is that the January 6th committee itself is so performative, illegitimate, unconstitutional, kicking off the Republicans that Leader McCarthy sent to serve on the committee. You know, we were accused by the majority leader of having our party hijacked. Our party is ascendant, and time is on our side, because when we take the majority back, this nonsense will come to an end. It's baffling to me that Democrats are so eager to conduct oversight over the last administration that is out of power, but it's hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil when it comes to the Biden administration. They're more worried about Trump's trade advisor than Joe Biden's son trading influence for foreign money. They're more worried about Trump's deputy chief of staff than deputizing the right folks to secure America's border. The January 6th committee is a sham. And if you took the position of the committee legally, no president would ever have privilege that would extend beyond the life of that presidency. And so no president would have the ability to have candid conversations with staff and advisors that might not immediately come back to bite them the moment they left the Oval Office. The American people see this for the partisan exercise that it is. Probably some folks at the Justice Department even see that it's a partisan exercise, because not all these contempt citations are well received at the Justice Department right now, and this contempt referral should similarly be ignored and rejected, and certainly is a stain on this House. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Indiana reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, a distinguished veteran of the Air Force and member of the Select Committee.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, for all practical purposes, Dan Scavino's career is Donald Trump. Scavino was 16 when they met, and he is to this day a Trump stalwart. Scavino was central to the Trump administration's social media program. He was, for 2 years, President Trump's deputy chief of staff for communications. Using social media to monitor trends and shape political views was Dan Scavino's core business. He did that for Donald Trump during the 2016 campaign, and he kept doing it right on through the Stop the Steal and the fraudulent challenge to the 2020 election. He also monitored extremist social media sites for the president. Dan Scavino was with the president on January 5th and 6th. He spoke with Trump by phone several times on January 6th and was with the president as many urged him to help stop the violence at the Capitol. So Dan Scavino could shed light on what then President Trump thought would happen on January 6th, especially the potential for violence. Did the president know that the rally could turn violent? That his rhetoric on the ellipse could send an angry mob to storm the Capitol? That what, on the evening of January 5th, President Trump called a fired-up crowd might take it literally when the next morning he told them to fight hard? That he was pouring fuel on the flames? Dan Scavino was there, so if he were willing to do his duty as a citizen, he could tell us a lot about that, but instead, he's chosen to stiff-arm the American people. President Trump acknowledged that Scavino sometimes helped shape his tweets. On December 19th, Trump retweeted a video that urged viewers to, quote, fight for Trump. The January 6th attack was then just 2.5 weeks away. Why did Donald Trump retweet that particular message? Dan Scavino could give us the inside scoop. And while Trump and his Stop the Steal gaggle were working hard to subvert the Constitution and steal the election for themselves, President Trump retweeted, after QAnon already had, a video called How to Steal an Election. What would Dan Scavino say about why Trump retweeted a QAnon-blessed video on how to steal an election? He won't risk telling us. And what did President Trump's extremist followers on The Donald and other hard-right sites make of Trump urging them to join a wild protest on January 6th? Posts show that some took it as marching orders. In fact, Dan Scavino had to know they would. Dan Scavino knew very well what his boss wanted. He knew that sites like The Donald attracted violent extremists. Scavino himself sent out a video that a user on that site understood as literal marching orders or literal war drums. President Trump and Dan Scavino had been in the White House for 4 years by then. They knew the January 6th crowd could turn violent. They knew exactly what they were doing. We are here today because Dan Scavino, a key witness, is unwilling to speak with us. He failed to produce a single document in response to the subpoena, and he has clearly demonstrated his complete and utter contempt for Congress. Dan Scavino's blatant disregard for our subpoena.
The gentleman's time has expired.
All right, I yield back. Thank you.
Yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
The gentleman's been yielded an additional 30 seconds.
I thank the gentleman. Dan Scavino's blatant disregard for our subpoena is his effort to ensure that Congress and the American people never get the firsthand story that he has to tell. None of us should find that acceptable. It is contempt for the law and contempt for Congress. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this resolution, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Mississippi reserves the balance of his time. The gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'd like to yield to my colleague, the gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar, for 3 minutes.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the Vice Chair for yielding. Thank you, Madam Speaker. We've been entrusted by the American people to investigate the attempt to overturn a free and fair election. That attempt to subvert the will of the American people resulted in a deadly attack on the people in this building. But it was bigger than just one day of violence and destruction that resulted in the deaths of U.S. Capitol police officers. For weeks, various schemes were hatched by individuals ranging from state legislators to the former president's senior aides to members of Congress with a singular objective: keep Donald Trump in office. These are the facts, Madam Speaker. Facts that were backed up last week by a federal judge who, after reviewing some of the evidence our committee has in its possession, said in part the illegality of the plan was obvious. We are here today to hold two individuals involved, Peter Navarro and Dan Scavino, in contempt of Congress. Peter Navarro has failed to comply with our investigation in any way, despite the fact that he's given multiple TV interviews. In fact, Mr. Navarro appeared on television in support of the former president's failed re-election efforts. So much so that he was found to have repeatedly violated the Hatch Act. But his political work did not stop when the election was over. We know Mr. Navarro led a call with state legislators about the efforts to convince Vice President Pence to delay election certification for 10 days. And we know Mr. Navarro spoke to Steve Bannon both during and after the attack on the U.S. Capitol. Mr. Navarro has publicly stated that he is protected by executive privilege, but he's never sought counsel as others have, and he has not filed any case seeking relief from his responsibilities to comply with our lawful subpoena. This is a textbook case for contempt, Madam Speaker. And while I'm not surprised by some of my colleagues who refuse to pull their heads out of the sand and face the facts of what really happened and continues to happen, I remain deeply concerned about what this country looks like if the perpetrators aren't held accountable. I urge my colleagues to support House Resolution 1037, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Wyoming reserves her time. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong.
The gentleman from North Dakota is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The fact is, President Trump has exerted executive privilege, and Mr. Scavino has raised the issue of executive privilege at President Trump's request. No matter how much my colleagues on the other side want to say differently, it is a legitimate assertion considering the D.C. Circuit Court and Nixon v. Administrator held that the executive privilege can be raised by a former president. A determination recently reinforced by Justice Kavanaugh and Trump v. Thompson by stating that the right of a former president to assert executive privilege exists even if the sitting president does not support that privilege. Concluding otherwise would in fact actually eviscerate the privilege in total. And keep in mind that the ruling on executive privilege in Trump v. Thompson deals with a narrow set of documents from the National Archives. It has no bearing on whether Mr. Scavino testifies. And the ruling does not apply to documents at issue in this case, nor does it testify to the testimony sought by the committee, or whether the committee has a legitimate purpose for conversations between President Trump and his aide. The Select Committee has refused to acknowledge President Trump's assertion of privilege as it applies to Mr. Scavino. And the committee takes an overexpansive view of what Trump v. Thompson actually says and fails to even acknowledge that the Supreme Court case of Nixon v. Administrator exists. This is not a settled question, and it is not nearly as clear-cut as some would have you to believe. And with that, I yield back.
And yields back his time. The gentleman from Indiana reserves his time. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much. Madam Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Florida, California, same neck of the woods, for 3 minutes, the chairlady of the House Administration Committee and a member of the Select Committee.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. No one is above the law. You know, we've all heard that phrase. It's a bedrock principle, and we know it's what distinguishes democracies like ours from autocracies such as Russia. Sadly, a few of the former president's closest aides and allies seem to think they're special, that they're above the law, including senior communications official Daniel Scavino, Jr. Now, who is he? According to many reports, Mr. Scavino worked with the former president to use social media to spread lies regarding non-existent election fraud and to recruit a violent, angry mob to D.C. Mr. Scavino also followed violent, extremist social media on behalf of Mr. Trump. We have reason to believe that doing so provided Mr. Scavino with explicit advance warnings of the violence that was to occur on January 6th. He may have shared these warnings of violence with Mr. Trump before the 6th, and we need to ask him about that. He reportedly attended several meetings with Mr. Trump and others regarding reversing the legitimate victory of President Trump. He was also with the former president during the Capitol attack when Mr. Trump failed to immediately try to stop it, despite urgent bipartisan calls for him to do so. You know, a federal court recently concluded that Mr. Trump likely committed a federal felony and that he and his allies, quote, launched a campaign to overturn a Democratic election that, quote, spurred violent attacks on the seat of our nation's government, led to the deaths of several law enforcement officers, and deepened public distrust in our political process. The court said that his effort was, quote, a coup in search of a legal theory. The court found that, quote, if President Trump's plan had worked, it would have permanently ended the peaceful transfer of power undermining American democracy and the Constitution. Democrats and Republicans have agreed that the very foundation of our constitutional republic was threatened. We must prevent that from ever happening again. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell rightly explained that the public needs to know everything about what caused and occurred on January 6th. To inform both the American people and legislative reform proposals, the Select Committee needs to speak with Mr. Scavino. He has to fulfill his legal and moral obligation to provide testimony and documents. Otherwise, he should face consequences. We must vote yes on this resolution to find him in contempt of Congress. In the United States of America, no one, including Mr. Scavino, is above the law. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlewoman yields back, but the gentleman from Mississippi reserves his time. The gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I know my colleague and friend, Mr. Armstrong, knows very well that, first of all, the executive privilege is a qualified privilege. Secondly, former President Trump has not asserted executive privilege. Third, I have tremendous respect, obviously, for Justice Kavanaugh, but my colleagues continue to quote Justice Kavanaugh without noting that the opinion in the D.C. Circuit, which was upheld by the Supreme Court, in that opinion, the judge found a number of things, including, quote, to allow the privilege of a no longer sitting president to prevail over Congress's need to investigate a violent attack on its home and its constitutional operations would gravely impair the basic function of the legislature. The court also held that under any of the tests advocated by former President Trump, the profound interests in disclosure advanced by President Biden and the January 6th committee far exceed his generalized concerns for executive branch confidentiality. And I would just repeat again, Madam Speaker, that Mr. Scavino and Mr. Navarro both have chosen not to appear in front of the committee to answer questions that are clearly outside of any potential claim of privilege they may have. And even if they believe there is a claim of privilege, they're obligated to appear and make that assertion. They cannot simply refuse to respond to the committee's subpoena. And I would now like to yield to my colleague from Florida, the gentlewoman, Ms. Murphy.
The gentlewoman's yielding how much time?
Minutes.
The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair, for yielding. And Madam Speaker, as a member of the committee charged with investigating the attack on our Capitol, our Constitution, and our country, I support this resolution to refer Peter Navarro and Daniel Scavino to the Department of Justice for contempt of Congress. I'll focus my remarks on Mr. Navarro. You know, there's clear evidence that Mr. Navarro was involved in efforts to keep President Trump in power after he lost the election. We subpoenaed Mr. Navarro, seeking testimony and documents regarding the actions he took to discredit the election and prevent the results from being certified. Mr. Navarro made a blanket claim of executive privilege, and this claim lacks merit as a matter of law and common sense. No president, either sitting or former, has claimed privilege regarding Mr. Navarro's testimony or documents, and Mr. Navarro has no authority to assert privilege himself. Beyond that fundamental flaw, since the election, Mr. Navarro has written and spoken widely about the subjects that are the focus of our subpoena. He's eager to tell his story, if he can do so on his terms, in a way that serves his interests. He published a book where he details the actions he took to change the outcome of the election. He writes that he worked with Steve Bannon on a scheme called the Green Bay Sweep. Its purpose was to encourage Vice President Pence to delay certification of the votes and send the election back to state legislatures. Mr. Navarro writes that he called Attorney General Barr, urging the Department of Justice to support President Trump's efforts to challenge the election in court, which Barr declined to do. Mr. Navarro notes that he kept a journal detailing this episode and other actions he took. And finally, while he was refusing to comply with our subpoena, Mr. Navarro made numerous media appearances discussing his roles in the events culminating on January 6th. Mr. Navarro has significant relevant knowledge. He's happy to share it on television and in podcasts, but he won't provide this information in response to a lawful subpoena. Mr. Navarro is in contempt of Congress and should be referred for prosecution. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from Wyoming reserves the balance of her time. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 4 minutes.
Madam Speaker, 15 months have passed since January 6th of 2021, yet I have seen little evidence over that time to indicate the necessary progress has been made to ensure the Capitol complex is more secure. And I've seen no evidence that the politicized Select Committee is serious about identifying or addressing the issues that led to our Capitol being so unprepared on that day, which should be its top priority. On February 17th of this year, the GAO released a report detailing the lack of security preparedness by Capitol Police leadership and the Capitol Police Board on and in the lead up to January 6th. The rank-and-file men and women who serve Congress as members of the Capitol Police put their lives on the line every day. Yet the Capitol Police Board, controlled by Speaker Pelosi, failed them. They deserve better. Instead of working to ensure our Capitol Police officers have the tools and the training they need to prevent another event like January 6th, or taking long overdue steps to reform the Capitol Police Board, the House is once again voting on a contempt resolution because two individuals are not complying with another sham subpoena issued by House Democrats. I have a news flash for members of the Select Committee. You do not have limitless power. You cannot demand testimony, documents, or even view the information of your political opponents without their consent or without the law on your side. You have neither. Specifically, Mr. Scavino and Mr. Navarro are unable to testify on specific topics that are related to their work in the White House, nor can they testify on communications between President Trump and the president's closest advisors, as those communications are protected under President Trump's claim of executive privilege. As a reminder, the American taxpayer is spending millions of dollars on this Select Committee. According to the Washington Post, the Select Committee is on pace to spend $9.3 million by the end of December. To put that into perspective, that amount exceeds the current budgets for the Committee on Judiciary, Agriculture, Budget, Ethics, the Committee on House Administration, Rules, Science, Small Business, Natural Resources, Homeland Security, Veterans Affairs, and Intelligence. That's right. This Select Committee is using more taxpayer resources on their partisan investigation than Democrats have devoted to serving veterans, addressing rising prices and inflation, or helping our farmers during a massive supply chain crisis. This is nothing more than a sham investigation full of misuses of congressional authority, including Speaker Pelosi violating 230 years of precedent by refusing to allow the minority party to select its own committee members, failing to investigate pursuant to a valid legislative purpose, altering evidence to fit a certain narrative, lying to witnesses, falsely accusing witnesses, violating opponents' right to challenge subpoenas, and perhaps above all, refusing to investigate why Speaker Pelosi and the Capitol Police Board left the Capitol so unprotected that day. I urge my colleagues to oppose, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Indiana reserves his time. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentlewoman from Virginia, a veteran of the United States Navy, Ms. Luria.
The gentlewoman from Virginia is recognized for 3 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I've come to the floor many times over the last 3 years and discussed the oath of office, the oath to protect and defend our Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Every member of this body swore that oath, and it's the same oath that our president and military officers, including those like Mr. Banks, swear in service to our nation. That's service. When an American enlists or commissions in the armed forces, when someone takes elected office and senior positions in the executive branch, they do so to serve the American people. Mr. Scavino and Mr. Navarro had the duty to serve the American people. Unfortunately, they instead chose to serve the interests of one man who sought to advance his own agenda at the peril of American democracy. They now have the duty to respond to the subpoenas of this committee, but they have apparently decided that they're above the law. The American people deserve the truth about the attack that attempted to prevent the peaceful transition of power, and the committee is united in our duty to investigate. This committee has conducted over 800 voluntary depositions and interviews with more schedules, including witnesses who worked in the previous administration and even close family members of the former president. The committee's received over 90,000 documents pertaining to January 6th, and we followed up over 435 tips received through the committee's tip line. Hundreds of witnesses have voluntarily come forward and cooperated with our investigation. But Mr. Scavino and Mr. Navarro have refused to do their part. They've been given every opportunity to come forward, yet they've attempted to obstruct the pursuit of justice and to stonewall the committee's work and conceal the truth, despite both publicly acknowledging their roles in promoting election fraud conspiracies and counseling the former president on changing the outcome of the election. Mr. Meadows, and today Mr. Scavino and Mr. Navarro, my question remains, what are you covering up and who are you covering for? Their failure to answer that question about January 6th is disregarding the law, and they should be held accountable. That is why I will vote, and I will urge my colleagues to vote to hold Mr. Navarro and Mr. Scavino in contempt of Congress, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Mississippi reserves his time. The gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I think it's, again, very important as our colleagues are contemplating their vote on this resolution that they keep in mind the facts. And we're hearing a number of things that are not consistent with the facts. First of all, with respect to the establishment of the committee, Mr. Davis knows, my colleagues know, that we initially attempted to have a bipartisan commission, which in fact Leader McCarthy instructed Mr. Katko to negotiate with Chairman Thompson. Mr. Katko did that, secured everything the Republicans asked for, at which point Mr. McCarthy walked away from the bipartisan commission and then went over to the Senate side and lobbied against the establishment of a bipartisan commission. The establishment of the Select Committee, again, is not what we would have hoped. We all, the 35 Republicans who voted for the bipartisan commission, wanted a bipartisan outside commission, but we cannot let this attack go uninvestigated. Mr. Davis also knows that with respect to the membership of the committee, Speaker Pelosi said that she would not name 2 members who had been identified by Mr. McCarthy. That is completely consistent with the resolution. And Mr. McCarthy then himself withdrew the other 3 and determined that he would not participate. Finally, Madam Speaker, I continue to hear this allegation that the committee is not investigating what happened at the Capitol, not investigating what happened with respect to the Capitol Police, not investigating what happened with respect to security that day. That's just not true. The committee has an entire team that is very focused on and investigating what happened with respect to security at the Capitol. It is also the case, though, Madam Speaker, we must all remember that the former president provoked a violent assault on this body. And the extent to which there were security lapses, the extent to which people did not anticipate that there would be a violent assault on the Capitol provoked by the former president is not the fault of the Capitol Police. That is the responsibility of the former president. And I would also note, Madam Speaker, that Mr. Davis voted yes on the bipartisan commission when it came up. I would now, Madam Speaker, like to yield 3 minutes to my good friend and colleague, from Maryland, Mr. Raskin.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. I just want to underscore first the point that was just made by Ms. Cheney. The distinguished ranking member of the House Administration Committee was appointed to this committee, or the appointment was accepted by Speaker Pelosi, but it was withdrawn by the minority leader. It was not rejected by the majority. It was rejected by the minority. Madam Speaker, you know, we're here in the broadest sense to defend American democratic institutions and the rule of law. And our colleague said before that if this investigation were valid, then we would be talking to officials from the Sergeant-at-Arms Office and the National Guard. Well, I've got good news for my friends. First, every court that has looked at their claim that this is an invalid investigation, either because of its composition or because it was intrinsically flawed in its pursuit of the facts about January 6th, has rejected those arguments. Every court that has looked at it has rejected the precise arguments our colleagues are floating on the floor today. But I'll go even further than that. We have, in fact, interviewed precisely the people that they set up as a test for the validity of our investigation from the Sergeant-at-Arms and the National Guard. And as patriotic public officials living out their oaths of office and not bowing down to the humiliating cult of Donald Trump, they didn't need a subpoena from this committee. They came voluntarily. They not only understood their legal duty to testify, a duty our colleagues, like my friend, the gentleman from Ohio, clearly understand when they wield the gavel, but they also have come forward and said that it is a patriotic honor for them It's not just a legal duty, it's a patriotic honor for them to render truthful testimony on this horrific attack against America, which interrupted the counting of electoral college votes for the first time in American history. This is mandated in the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, which says that the House and the Senate must meet in joint session in order to count electoral college votes the first week of January, on the Wednesday following a presidential election. What's remarkable to me is that the caucus that's now so drenched in the Trump-Putin propaganda is not just trying to denounce the Democrats for searching the truth right now. Today, they've begun the utterly cannibalistic process of vilifying and castigating Republicans just because they disagree with the orthodoxy, the dogma handed down by Donald Trump. Ms. Cheney is the former chair of the House Republican Conference, and it's left to Democrats to defend her against the vilification and the castigating that we hear from...
30
seconds.
30 seconds.
An additional 30 seconds has been yielded to the gentleman from Maryland.
It is up to us to defend Mr. Kinzinger and to defend Ms. Cheney. Because if you don't go along with what Donald Trump says, if you don't act like you're a robot or a member of a religious cult, they will attack you, they will vilify you, they will denounce you. These people, Mr. Kinzinger, Ms. Cheney, are constitutional heroes, and they don't deserve your contempt. The insurrectionists and the lawbreakers deserve your contempt because they are acting in contempt of the rule of law and the Constitution of the United States. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from Wyoming reserves her time. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Jackson.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you to my colleague from Indiana for the time. Madam Speaker, I rise today to speak about two great patriots who I'm proud to call my friends, Dan Scavino and Peter Navarro. These two men have served our country honorably. Sadly, they are now targets of the political witch hunt simply because they served our country and they are loyal to our great former president, Donald J. Trump. The illegitimate January 6th committee's ruthless crusade against President Trump and his close allies is yet another smear on this great body. It will go down in history as another failed attempt by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to bring down good people simply because they disagree with their political beliefs. As someone who's been a target of the left and their ruthless tactics in the past, I know firsthand how damaging this can be. The American people are tired of this partisan January 6th circus. It's time to stop this nonsense now. I urge my colleagues to stand up against this charade and oppose this baseless resolution. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman from Indiana reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much. Madam Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Mississippi reserves the balance of his time. The gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
I reserve, Madam Speaker.
The gentlewoman reserves her time. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. The Majority Leader just a few minutes ago used the term danger to our democracy. Danger to our democracy. Think about this. Democrats have closed the Capitol, allowed proxy voting, kicked Republicans off committee, won't let Republicans serve on this select committee. First time in the history of the Congress, the Minority Leader was not allowed to put on a select committee the individuals he or she selected. First time in the history of our nation. Democrats are trying to end the Electoral College, trying to end the filibuster, trying to pack the court. This committee, the January 6th committee, altered evidence and presented to the American people as if it were true. And they accuse us of being a danger to our democracy? Mr. Gates was right. We got a border that is complete chaos. We have $6 gas in California, $4 gas everywhere else in the country. We have crime at record levels in every major urban area in this nation. And we have an inflation problem that's at a 40-year high. And this committee has more contempt resolutions for a purely political reason. I think the whole committee is purely political, designed to do one thing, keep President Trump off the ballot in 2024. The gentlelady from Wyoming in her opening comments used the term false message. False, she used to say big lie, now I guess it's false message. And I just jotted, I thought when she said, I started jotting things down. Think about all the false messages we've got from them in the last few years. They told us the protests in the summer of 2020 were peaceful. Got $1 billion worth of damage around our cities that says it wasn't. They told us the dossier was real. They told us it was Republicans who wanted to defund the police. That's almost laughable if it wasn't so serious for our law enforcement and for the families who live in those areas where mayors and city councils did defund the police. They told us the FBI didn't spy on the Trump campaign. We know that wasn't true. We got Inspector General reports that tell us all kinds of things about what they did in front of the FISA court. They said Trump colluded with Russia. We got a Mueller report, 19 lawyers, 40 FBI agents, 30 million hard-earned American tax dollars in that report that said that false message was just that, false. They told us COVID didn't start in the lab. Sure looks like it did. They told us the lab wasn't doing gain-of-function research. Sure looks like it was. They told us the vaccinated can't get it. We know that's wrong. Every day there's a new announcement. A member of Congress is getting it. Fully vaccinated, boosted, everything else. They told us the vaccinated can't transmit it. They told us that was wrong. And you talk about the biggest false message that's just been confirmed in the last week, how false it was. The Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation. The Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation. October 22nd, 2020, 2 weeks before the election, candidate Biden, in a debate, is asked about his son's business dealings with foreign companies. He says, quote, nothing was unethical. He said, my son has not made money with business interests with companies with an interest in China. And we all know there are 4.8 million reasons why that statement was not accurate. And how do we know? Washington Post told us. Not me, not President Trump, not Republicans. The Washington Post told us last week, 2 stories last week, a week ago today, one at 11 a.m., one at 11:04 a.m. 2 8-page articles, 4 minutes apart, confirming what we knew, but what big media, big tech, Democrats colluded to keep from the American people just days before the most important election we have, the presidential election. Who's going to be our next commander-in-chief? The laptop was real, the eyewitness was real, the emails were real. The only thing fake was that collusion from those individuals, those entities, to keep important information from we the people in the run-up to the most important election we have. And oh, by the way, they were joined by 51 former intel officials, joined in the collusion. You know, it's also interesting, it's funny how that story has changed. 18 months ago, started off, wasn't his laptop, quickly switched to, well, it was his laptop, but it was Russian disinformation. And now it is, well, it wasn't Russian disinformation, but Joe Biden had nothing to do with it. Now it was, well, Joe knew what was going on, but he wasn't really involved in anything wrong. Ron Klain told us that. Chief of Staff told us that Sunday. We need to be focused on the issues that the American people want us to focus on. If you want to talk about danger to our democracy and the biggest false message, I would say what happened, one of the biggest dangers to our democracy and one of the biggest false messages is what happened 18 months ago, where that story was kept from the American people. We could dig into that, find out what went on there, why that happened, and we could also focus on the record crime, record inflation, record price of gas, and the chaos on our southern border that's about to get worse as the Democrats look to, as the Biden...
Gentleman's recognized for 30 more seconds.
Title 42. I urge a no vote. Yield back.
Gentleman from Indiana reserves. Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers and am prepared to close.
The gentleman reserves.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Wyoming.
I have no further speakers either. I'm prepared to.
The gentleman from Indiana.
Speaker, prepared to close.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, it might feel really good today for my opponents on the other side of the aisle. It might feel really good in the vindictive sort of way to vote to put their political opponents behind bars. That might feel really good for my opponents across the aisle, but I guarantee you the history will not look back kindly on those actions in the years to come. I guarantee it. It couldn't be any more un-American what they want to do today to vote to put 2 men behind bars purely because they disagree with their politics and the man that they worked for. I can't think of a bigger reason for my opponents to vote no on such an un-American, resolution, urge all of my colleagues to vote no and do the same. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it does not feel really good today. It feels sad, and it feels tragic that so many in my own party are refusing to address the constitutional crisis and the challenge that we face. The ranking member of the Judiciary Committee went to law school. I'm not sure if he passed the bar, but he knows that we all have an obligation to abide by the rulings of the courts. So yes, it was a false story. Yes, it was a big lie. In fact, former Vice President Pence has said that what President Trump wanted him to do was, quote, un-American. It was also unconstitutional, and it was illegal. Mr. Speaker, what gives me tremendous hope, though, is although so many in my party in this body have put loyalty to Donald Trump ahead of their oath to the Constitution, the committee has interviewed scores of Republicans from around the country who, in fact, have shown the kind of tremendous bravery and dedication to public service that every American can be proud of. Republicans who were appointed by President Trump to posts in the Department of Justice, Republicans who stood firm, Republicans who threatened to resign, and who refused to participate in President Trump's efforts to corrupt the Department of Justice with the stolen election lies, yes, lies, that led to January 6th. We've heard from Republicans serving in state legislatures and state and local governments who also stood firm. Mr. Speaker, it is crucially important that this body hold these gentlemen in contempt. It's crucially important that they have to abide by their subpoena. I urge a yes vote, and I yield back the balance of my
gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me say for the record, if there's any member on the other side who feel the strength to come and testify before our committee, I invite them right now to let us know, and we will gladly entertain whatever information they have as to what happened on January 6th. Some of them ran out of this building fearing for their life. So there's no question that something happened. And House Resolution 503 says, absolutely, we have to find the facts and circumstances as to what happened and why, and make recommendations. And that's what we have to do. We have the constitutional power to issue subpoenas. If people do not follow subpoenas, we have the right to bring them before this body and recommend contempt citations. And that's what we're doing today. So it doesn't matter that if they were a father, a mother, a sister, a brother, had children. If they break the law, they break the law. No one's above the law. And that's what the point we're trying to make. We asked the individuals, subpoenaed them to come before the committee, and they chose not to come, and therefore they broke the law, and that's why we're here today. So, Mr. Speaker, as I've mentioned when I testified before the Rules Committee, it's absurd that there should be any disagreement at all about why we're here for this contempt resolution. If you listen to the arguments from some of my friends on the other side, they have very little to say of substance of this matter. We hear excuses, we hear attacks about process, we hear scaremongering about the Select Committee. Let me remind my colleagues, we've conducted over 830 interviews and depositions. And again, I invite any of them to come talk to us if they want to. Now, if for some reason they are reluctant or afraid, then I feel sorry for them. Our constitutional democracy was challenged on January 6th. We have to fix this. Over 200 years, we've operated in complete freedom, and all of a sudden, this institution was attacked, and we have to fix that. We are the #1 democracy in the world, but we lead by example. Democrats are leading by example. This Select Committee is leading by example by bringing these two gentlemen who broke the law, who decided that it's better to deal with the law of Donald Trump rather than the Constitution of the United States of America. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague, especially my friend from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney. I urge every member to support adoption of this resolution. Mr. Speaker, with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the previous question is ordered on the resolution. The question is on adoption of the resolution. All those in favor, say aye. All those opposed, say no. The ayes have it. The resolution. Pursuant to Section 3 of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device.